Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cinema Flow podcast. I'm your host, Zach Abdulbaki, and today I'm joined by a very special guest. He is the writer, director, and producer of the new film I Swear, Mr. Kirk Jones. I Swear follows the true life story of John Davidson, a man with Tourette syndrome. The film charts his journey from a misunderstood teenager in the 1980s to the present day. It's a heartwarming story about a man who finds inspiration in the kindness of others to discover his true purpose in life. The film stars Robert Aramayo, who won the BAFTA award for Best Lead Actor, deservedly so in my opinion. This is a fantastic film that will make you laugh and cry. In fact, the film has a 100% fresh score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 4.2 out of 5 on Letterboxd as of this recording. I Swear will be released this Friday, April 24th, in cinemas across the US. Now, please welcome to the show the writer, director, and producer of I Swear, Mr. Kirk Jones. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm good. I'm good. Nice to speak to you.
Nice to meet you as well. Before we get into I Swear, I must mention that you made one of my favorite childhood films, Nanny McPhee. I had that movie on DVD and I watched it dozens of times growing up. It's an absolute classic.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I have very fond memories of that, and I still have people coming up to me and talking about the scene where the baby gets boiled. Is
Yeah.
one of the favorite. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a classic. It's a class, and it's. I think you've outdone yourself, though. I think that I Swear is your best film yet. And I gave the audience a little taste of the plot, but in your own words, can you talk about the story and how this film came about?
It's a true story, and it's about John Davidson, who, when he was 14 years old, having had a relatively normal life up to that point, started to discover that he was developing Tourette syndrome. And in particular, John had a version is called coprolalia, which means that he shouts inappropriate things. And of course, as a young man, number one, he wasn't believed. Number two, he was told he would end up in an asylum or end up in prison. And he managed to turn his life around. He's had an incredible life, and he was eventually awarded an MBE by the Queen in 2019, which is one of the highest honors that you can achieve in the UK.
Yeah, and it's an amazing story, and I think this is a very rare example of a film that makes me both laugh and cry. And I think that's very realistic because life is often not humorless. You know, even in the darkest of circumstances, people cope with sorrow by making jokes. Can you talk about managing that tone and striking the right balance where we're laughing with John, but not at him, of course?
Yeah, when I first met John, I said, look, if I say to you that I feel I can identify a level of humor in the condition, how would that make you feel? Would it upset you? Would it irritate you? He said, no. He said, my life is the funniest and the most dramatic and tragic that you can ever imagine. And I thought I was almost in at that point. I thought, okay, let's go. Because throughout my career, I've really enjoyed working on projects which combine humor and emotion for the exact reason that you've just said, because life is like that. You often, some of the best funerals I've been to, the eulogies introduce a level of humor. And at a point where people are feeling incredibly sad and mournful, the best human, antidote to that is natural humor that everyone appreciates. So John says it's a very important part of the condition, not being laughed at, which has happened throughout John's life, but laughing with him and with the absurd vocal tics that come out of him. So I recognize that. Of course, I recognize, the drama and the tragedy. And it was just really my responsibility to decide where I place everything in the script and how I present it. So, for example, in the opening scene, John receives his MBE from the Queen, and he does what he knew would end up happening. He shouts something which is inappropriate. And that to me felt like a funny moment. Yeah, no one got hurt. He was in a safe environment. People thought it was funny. In fact, on the day, one of the Queen's guards put his hand on John's shoulder after he shouted at the Queen and said, "Don't worry, John, the Queen understands." So for many reasons, it felt like a humorous scene, and it felt like a good scene to start the film. Later on, we see John in the street, and as a girl walks by, he just says "slut." And what that results in, he explains to the girl, he apologizes to the girl, he explains his condition. She doesn't believe him. She goes home, tells her boyfriend 2 days later. John is beaten to within an inch of his life with an iron bar by the girl's boyfriend and his friend. So these are all true stories, and they were told to me by John over a number of days. I recorded everything, and then I just started to build up the script. But I wasn't worried about, smashing, not just gently placing, but smashing together scenes or moments which I felt were humorous with scenes which were very moving. I think audiences are really smart. I've spent years as a filmmaker being told, the audience is stupid. We've got to do this. We've got to do that. I think especially when it comes to reading emotions, we are still, despite the amount of time we spend on computers and TVs and in front of screens, I think we are still very, very good at reading human emotion. And people are describing this as a roller coaster. They're saying it's funny, it's entertaining. They feel uplifted at the end. But I've seen the film in Canada, in the US, throughout Europe. I've seen it dubbed. I've seen it with subtitles, and every time the audience laughs and cries exactly the same moments. So I think that's encouraging for the human race, that we are still very, very our emotions and the reading of other people's emotions are still intact, hopefully.
Absolutely. And, with that opening scene you mentioned, it's like I don't really know anyone personally who has Tourette's, but in that little opening scene, I felt like, oh, I am starting to understand this. Like it's clearly not within his control what he's saying, and yet it is humorous because it's the most shocking thing you would never expect anyone to say in that situation. I must say, like, I also cried while watching this film, and it didn't really happen during the sad moments of the film, like when John gets beaten up. It actually happened more when certain characters are being kind to him, like when
Yeah,
Tommy testifies on his behalf and says he's a good person, or when Dottie tells him to never apologize for something he can't
yeah.
control. And I think those moments are so touching because they're unexpected. We're so used to people being mean to each other on social media and whatever. But I'm curious, why do you think people find the film touching? And did you get emotional like when you heard this story for the first time from John?
I definitely got emotional. I remember getting emotional in 1989 when I saw the first documentary, which was called John's Not Mad, and he was 14 years old then. And I got emotional when he was telling me all of his stories. I think there are key moments in the film where people feel emotional because of what's happening to him. And I think it comes from a point of understanding. One of the things that someone said to me from the neurodiverse community was, just remember that your normal isn't necessarily the same as everybody else's normal. And I think we're all guilty of that. I walk down the street, I get a coffee, I come back, no problem, no problem at all. For John to do that, it's an absolute nightmare. It's like climbing a mountain. Who's he going to meet? What's he going to say? Are they going to be sympathetic, or are they going to want to punch him in the face? And it's not just John, and it's not just people with Tourette's. Anyone with a neurodiverse condition like autism or OCD, ADHD, my son has incredibly high anxiety. Just going out into the street can be a huge challenge. And I think that idea of thinking of other people, of being empathetic, of understanding that we aren't always the same, and that we should celebrate that, is a really important lesson to be reminded of at this point in history in particular, because all we know is that whenever we look at social media, whenever we turn on the TV, we are trying to be kind of guided towards a black and white view of the world. This is how it is. You need to take a side. What's your opinion? Who do you want to like? Who do you want to follow? What channels are you going to watch? And it doesn't promote a very caring, understanding society. In fact, it's the opposite. So I think there's a much bigger message that comes through in the film. And you're right, there are moments. A lot of people have said to me that when Dottie says to John, if you cannot help something that you do, you don't need to apologize. And that is mind blowing for John Davidson in the film and it was in real life, because he'd spent all of his life feeling that he had to apologize to everyone. And she said, if you cannot help it, you do not need to apologize. And so many men in particular, and I'm not sure why, have come to me and said they cried then. And, it's an important moment in the film, but I wouldn't have thought it was one of the top 10, where you actually feel emotional. But I suspect that all of us probably have grown up in a society where we felt we had to apologize, where our parents would say, you apologize for that now, you apologize. And, if you've genuinely done something wrong, of course you should apologize. But there are many things that people do that they cannot help. They might have a condition, or they might feel upset, or they might behave in a way that they didn't mean to. It wasn't their fault, but they end up having to apologize, and that kind of makes the incident worse. It sort of doubles down. You've done something you can't help, but then you've had to apologize to everyone, which makes it look like you did it on purpose.
I want to talk about your cinematography. I noticed you used a much taller aspect ratio for this film. I believe it's 185, as opposed to the
Yeah,
much wider aspect ratio 239 that you used for some of your previous films like Everybody's Fine and My Big Fat
yeah.
Greek Wedding 2 and Ned Divine. So why was 1.85 the right choice for this movie narratively? And could you talk about working with your cinematographer to craft the look and feel of this movie? Because it does look incredible.
It does look incredible. And on this occasion, I decided to go with a DP called James Bland. He'd never shot a feature film before. I probably reached out to about 25 DPs. I took quite a lot of time. I looked at a lot of reels. I met a lot of people. I got it down to about 10. And I settled on James. I just thought his attitude, his instinct about the material was great. And I like mixing up crew. So, for example, my sound recordist, who's incredible, we never had to ADR one single line on the whole film. And when you consider John is ticking and shouting all the time, that's extraordinary. But Simon Hayes and his sound crew are an Academy-winning crew, and they're on set. And then James Bland, who has never shot a film in his life before, was also on set. And I love that energy that sort of translates between people who are very experienced and people who are incredibly excited because it's their first opportunity. One of the things we talked about, and this might answer your question about framing, is that John's form of Tourette's, which is called coprolalia, is not only quite aggressively verbal, but also physical. And in particular, John punches out with his right arm. So you can see now on this video link that you can't really appreciate my punch because you're too close. So everything was shot much wider. So that if Rob suddenly threw out an arm, it was captured. We wouldn't have to ask him to repeat it again on a different angle. We had it. So that determined a lot of the framing. We wanted to make it look, I just figured that because it was a lot of information for the audience, it was, especially if you weren't familiar with the condition, there was a lot going on. And I figured that the best way to help the audience enter the film was to make it look a little bit like a documentary, like a beautiful documentary. And it still looks wonderful and is absolutely a feature film, and it's entertaining and it's funny and it's got a big ending. And so it kind of delivers on all those aspects. But I just figured that if people believed John, if they believed the world, that would help them understand the condition more. So that's why it kind of looks. That's why it looks like it looks.
I want to also talk about the editing in this movie because the pacing is remarkable. And there's some really interesting moments like the scene with John and Lucy in the alleyway where you just
Yeah,
stay on a two shot and you don't edit at all for 3 minutes. You just let the
yeah.
actors perform naturally without any close-ups. I'm curious if you could talk about some of the choices like that because I feel like a film school professor would probably tell you that you need to break it up with coverage, but I like it exactly as it is. It doesn't need that.
Yeah. Well spotted. I mean, that was probably my favorite shot, not only in the movie, but maybe that I've ever committed to film, um, or a digital format, as we are now. So I set up a wide shot in the back alley and we started the take. And Rob and Andrea, so Andrea did have Tourette's. She had Tourette's. It's a really neat story, actually. Rob and I were so impressed with her that we then, after the production, recommended that she try and find an agent. She recently got a role in a BBC program, and she's now on TV, and she's now working as an actress. So that was a really nice story for someone from the Tourette's community. But Rob and Andrea had spent a lot of time together. Rob wanted to make sure that she felt at ease. And on the day, I think it was take one, just started running the camera, and I was shooting it as a wide shot, as you say. If you look at a textbook, it would say cover the wide shot and then cover some mids and some close-ups. I didn't need to do that because the take was so beautiful and so perfect. I think it's about 3.5 minutes long. It's the longest take I've ever included in any film that I've ever shot in 25 years. And I just sat there and I just watched it unfold. And of course, all you're thinking in real time is just keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. And then eventually they get up and they leave and they walk out of frame. And I sat there and I thought, I would not have, if I could go back and spend a year on that scene, I would not change a single thing. And we just topped and tailed it in the cutting room, and that's how it is. 3.5 minutes in the film. And I felt that the intensity and the importance of their conversation justified it, just holding the natural performances, the way they improvised around my scene beautifully. It was great. It was all good. So you would have that, at the beginning of the film, there's some sort of fast cuts and kind of title sequences and things. Just wanted to keep the energy going, and just get people into the film and help them get back to the 1980s. And I think the music's quite important in the film. So that was New Order. Blue Monday was playing, which suggests it, deserves something which is a bit cuttier to get people going. So yeah, it was just really taking it a scene at a time and allowing Rob to just have space and air around him, in the frame to do whatever he wanted to do.
I love that scene because she says she's never met anyone with Tourette's before. And that was, he was like, is this helpful for you? And she was like, yeah. And it was very touching.
But what's even more touching is that when I first met Andrea, we had a meeting where we invited all of the community that were local to Scotland. There were probably about 40 or 50 people there. And at the end of that session, I saw Andrea exchanging contact details with a couple of girls who also had Tourette's. And I said to her, did you have a nice time? She's 23 years old. She said, yeah, I've never met anyone with Tourette's before. So not only was that in the film as part of the story, that was Andrea's experience in real life. By being approached, by being invited to come in and meet me and given the part, she met the Tourette's community, and she had never met anyone with Tourette's before. And this is 2026, and she's 23 years old. And I was amazed at that. But it's literally changed her life. She's now helping people, other people in the Tourette's community. Yeah.
You mentioned your music. Stephen Rennicks is your composer, and he did one of my favorite films, Room, from Lenny Abrahamson. Can you
Me
talk?
too.
Yeah. Were there any scores that you referenced as inspiration for what you wanted to do here?
When I was, what always happens, no matter how well planned it is, you never have original score from
Right.
the composer that you're about to work with when you're in the cutting room. It's talked about a lot, but there's never actually the time to do it. So I'm sat there in the cutting room and I thought, well, I know I want to work with Stephen. I've already spoken to Stephen. He says he wants to do it. I'm committed to Stephen. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go through Stephen's scores from the past. And Room was one of the key scores. I love that music when it first came out. And I don't know if you're similar to me, but I just play it for months on end. I just don't stop, which is sad. It's really sad, but it was really stuck in my head. So most of the music that I use, well, I think I'm going to say all of the score that I cut to was from Stephen, and I would say 80% of it was from Room. So yeah.
Yeah, that ending shot in Room where the really tall like crane shot, that the music
Yeah.
on that shot is just incredible. I would be remiss if I did not mention your lead actor, Robert Aramayo. He won the BAFTA for Best Lead Actor. I heard that you cast him without an audition. Is that true? And if so, how did you know he was the right person for this role?
Well, I met him. I Zoomed with him. I took him up to Scotland to meet John. I knew with the conversations that we'd had that he was right for the role. And we did discuss whether we should put something on tape. And Rob said, I'm really happy to do that. He said, I just want you to be aware that at this moment in time, because I know nothing about John and I know nothing about Tourette's, it will be nothing more than an impersonation. And he said, I don't really want to impersonate someone who has, a medical condition. What I would like to do, my preference would be to spend the next 3 months researching, speaking to people with Tourette's, understanding John, understanding the condition. He said, but I'm really happy to do something on tape. And the film was financed in an incredibly unusual way. I won't bore you with the details, but basically, the first person we went to ask about finance, they said, you need to reduce the swearing. I said, I'm not doing that. I promised John I will tell an honest version of his story. And I promised myself, after directing films for 25 years, I wasn't going to dumb this down. So my wife and I had just sold our house. We didn't sell it intentionally, we just sold it anyway, and we were renting. So, probably for the first time in my life, everything I had was in a bank account, just sitting there ready to buy the next house. And I went to the bank and I said, would you lend me, if we gave you all of that, would you lend me more? And they said yes. My wife agreed, unbelievably. So, for the first time ever, I made this film with total and complete freedom, creative freedom. I had no one above me. I had no financiers, no studios, no executive producers, giving me notes. And the film is, I'm not saying this for any other reason, because other than I think it might be an interesting talking point within the film industry. So we were left alone as responsible, creative people, as a production, as a cast, as a crew. We delivered a film with a lead actor that I would never have been allowed to have cast if I had gone a traditional route of financing, because they would have said he's not famous enough. I was nominated for a BAFTA for my script, which had 0 notes. Rob won Rising Star and the main actor BAFTA. My casting director, who I was allowed to work with properly and creatively without anyone interfering, also won a BAFTA. Peter Mullen, support actor, nominated for a BAFTA. So I'm only saying that because maybe it's just a coincidence, or maybe there's a lesson to be learned there, that when a group of people are left alone without financiers, studios, investors interfering and giving notes after notes after notes, maybe when left alone, creative people can deliver films that audiences really want to see, and actually that critics really appreciate as well. Now, that's not for me to decide. I'm just saying maybe. But, I think the evidence is pretty clear that when left alone, we were able to deliver something which was different and interesting and fresh, and people want that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're taking this to most financiers, they'd say, okay, we're happy to make a movie about Tourette's, but can you make
Yeah,
it a horror movie that's based on a video game that stars a TikTok star?
exactly.
But
Exactly. Yeah.
in this case, I think that the quality was just so undeniable that now the word of mouth is going to be so strong that I mean, I don't know what the budget was, but I imagine you might even be already clear even before it opens in the US.
The truth is, I've worked now for 4 years and I haven't made a single penny, and we have not got our money back. So I don't regret it. I believe that if we keep going and once it's played out around the world, we will at least get our money back, and hopefully we can pay out. A lot of the crew deferred their fees and things as well. So I think people are assuming that financially this was an incredible thing for us, and actually that is yet to be seen, because I haven't earned a penny.
Sir, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. It's truly an incredible film, and I hope that people watch it in the cinema. Once again, I Swear comes out on April 24th in the US, and it's currently on Netflix in the UK. You'll laugh, you'll cry. It's a remarkable film. Anything you'd like to say before we sign out?
No, I think people will be entertained with the film. I think they'll laugh a lot. They might even cry a lot. I think they will come out feeling elated, and perhaps without even knowing it, they might even be educated on a certain level about neurodiverse conditions and people who are not exactly the same as they are. And I think that's a really important thing to remember at this moment in time, that we're all different and we should celebrate that.
Thank you, sir. And thank you to everyone for listening to this episode of the Cinema Flow podcast. We'll be back next week, but until then, stay safe and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.